Hi everyone. This morning I'm going to be talking about the research that I'm doing for my PhD, which involves trying to improve our understanding of the way that trees affect the climate. So in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit about what the main factors are that control our climate here on Earth. So we get a certain amount of... So the Earth receives a certain amount of energy that comes to us from the sun. Some of it's reflected away by clouds and particles in the atmosphere, and the rest of it's absorbed by the surface. That radiation, that energy, is then re-emitted into the atmosphere in a slightly different form, and the naturally occurring greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere trap a portion of that energy to keep it within the climate system, and that maintains a habitable temperature on the Earth. But because human activities have actually led to an increase in the concentration of these greenhouse gases, we're trapping more of that radiation within the Earth system, and that's led to a temperature increase. So we've already seen, since pre-industrial times, an increase of about 1 degree temperature change globally. And this map shows how we can expect temperatures in different regions of the Earth to change by the end of the century. So these temperature changes are relative to the average temperatures experienced during the 80s and 90s in each location. And you can see that you might be able to see that the temperature changes range from about 1 to 2 degrees, right up to an increase of 7.5 degrees in average temperature. And that's not an insignificant increase. That doesn't mean that everywhere will just be a little bit warmer and the climate will be nice. That means that millions of people will be at risk of drought, famine and flooding as a result of sea level increases. So from this map, it's kind of hard to see how we'll be affected in Europe. We should expect a temperature increase that's somewhere in the middle of this range that's represented here. But we'll also get more rain during the winter. And as a result of that, there'll be a higher risk of flooding from rivers and also at the coastlines as a result of sea level rise. And we'll also be experiencing more temperature extremes. And that's really important because that's things like the heat wave that Europe experienced in 2003, which led to a significant number of premature deaths across the continent. So we know that this is happening because we've increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that occurs predominantly through our emissions of carbon from fossil fuel combustion. But there's also another way that carbon gets into the atmosphere, and that's from this thing called land use change, which is predominantly the deforestation of tropical regions. And so the amount of carbon emitted into the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion is still increasing, but there's also a significant component as well from deforestation. And estimates at the moment suggest that about 12% of total carbon emissions from human activities are actually coming from deforestation. So we know that trees store carbon, and during the process of deforestation, that carbon is released back into the atmosphere and adds to the burden of greenhouse gases. But what's not clear is whether trees and forests are also contributing to the second part of this energy balance of the climate system, how they interact with the radiation coming in from the sun. And that's what my research aims to establish, really, whether they are playing a role in this part of the energy balance. And the way that they might be able to do that is because we know that trees and other kinds of vegetation emit gas molecules into the atmosphere. So they're things like monoterpenes and isoprene that I've given the structure of here. And if you're walking through a forest and you can smell that kind of piney odour, that's actually the result of these chemical emissions. But these molecules themselves don't hang around for very long in the atmosphere. They actually react very quickly with things like ozone to form more complicated molecules. And it's these molecules that are really interesting from a climate point of view. Because we know that they can combine with other gases in the atmosphere and form particles. So they can make molecular clusters and form particles by combining with gases that can come from natural sources, but also from, it can be emitted from human activities as well. And the other really important thing that these molecules do is that they're able to stick to other particles in the atmosphere. So these particles can be things that come from natural sources again, like sea salt from the ocean, dust and also carbonaceous particles from the combustion of fossil fuels. So they can stick to these particles and help them to grow to larger sizes. And that's the thing that's really important, because when particles get to a certain size, and if they're made of the right stuff, they're able to act as a nucleus to form cloud droplets. So the more particles you have that are larger, the more particles you have that are able to form cloud droplets. And that's important, because the more cloud droplets there are in a given cloud, the brighter it will be. And that means it will reflect away more of the sun's energy, because there's more opportunities for the energy to be reflected back within the cloud. So this effect has a cooling effect on the planet. And the idea of my research is to try and understand globally how important this could be. So to do that, I use a detailed computer model that simulates, you can't see that very well, so the model simulates the global atmosphere, and we put into the model various sources of particles in the atmosphere, so combustion particles, natural particles from the ocean, and also particles that are released by natural fires in forests. So if you imagine that this space here is like a box in the atmosphere in our model, we tell the model kind of processes that are going on, we give it all the ingredients, and then the model calculates the number and size of particles that are in the atmosphere and how that changes over time. So for my research, I've been adding in these molecules that come from the trees to try and find out how it affects the number, size, and composition of these particles, and then most importantly, how that goes on to affect the clouds and the climate. So what is the effect? Well, this map shows globally what happens when I include these emissions from trees. It's not come out brilliantly because of the light, sorry about that. But you can see that in the regions that have a yellow or red colour are experiencing an increase in the kind of particles that are able to form cloud droplets. And these are really significant increases. We're talking increases of more than 100% in some of these regions. And that's just as a result of the emissions from the trees. So you can see that some of the increases, okay, the pointer completely didn't work, but you can see that some of the increases are occurring in places where there are a lot of forests and therefore a lot of emissions from the trees. But also you see big increases in places that have a lot of particulate emissions from human activities, and that's because of the way that the emissions from the trees and the human particles emitted by human activities combine in the atmosphere to result in more of these particles that are large enough to form cloud droplets. But the reason we're interested in this is to understand how it affects the climate. So I take that change in the number of particles and use another model that simulates how the amount of radiation coming into and leaving the Earth system will change as a result of the inclusion of these molecules. So this map shows how the flux of energy is changing. So anywhere with a blue colour is actually experiencing a cooling effect. And so you can see that there are large patches of quite significant cooling. And what's interesting to note is that they're not often over the areas that I actually had the biggest changes in these particles that can form cloud droplets. So the other important thing that we need to think about is even though we've got more cloud potentially forming particles, the effect is only significant in regions where there is a lot of cloud and that we're able to perturb. So you can see that it's across the planet, it's not a spatially uniform effect. So in some regions, there'll be more cooling as a result of this than others. But we can take a global average of the effect, and that gives me a cooling effect of almost 1 watt per metre squared. And that's how we quantify changes in energy fluxes within the atmosphere. And to give you an idea of how important that is, it's about half the magnitude of the warming effect that has occurred because of the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere since pre-industrial times. So comparatively, this is a very important effect. But it's important to stress that this is something that's happening in the atmosphere. So this isn't, I'm not suggesting a cooling. this is a cooling that's already taking place. And so the important thing is that if we were to take these trees away, this cooling would disappear and we would see a warming. So, to summarise, if you can read that we know that deforestation accounts for about 12% of all carbon emissions that occur due to human activities. But we now know that the particles that are formed in the atmosphere because of the molecules emitted by trees are also exerting a cooling effect on the climate. So if we're removing those trees during deforestation, we're actually warming the planet more than we thought we were before. So the next steps for me are to try and understand which of these forests are having the biggest effect, which ones are the most important for us to preserve. And then I want to try and find out whether we can enhance this effect by planting more trees. So should afforestation form an important part of our strategy to mitigate climate change? Because really, the only way that we can form a strategy to combat climate change is by understanding fully what we're actually doing to the climate. And we were asked to say a little bit about how we're having an impact with our research. And for me, that's through my role with a charity called the United Bank of Carbon. So we're a collaboration of scientists from the university and local business people that aim to secure funding for rainforest protection projects in the tropics. And these projects aren't just a case of buying areas of rainforest so that they don't get cut down. The projects involve introducing sustainable agriculture techniques and community development activities so that the local communities have an alternative to deforestation, and in that way, we're reducing it. So an exciting development at the moment is that we're setting up a project for the University of Leeds, so staff and students will be able to contribute directly to saving an area of rainforest in Tanzania or potentially Malawi. And so that's probably going to be getting set up in the early part of next year, so that's something to keep your eyes